Hello everyone, Plato here, and today we will be taking a look at our spells tier list and all the juicy numbers behind the scenes. Remember that these tier lists are highly personal as we all have different playstyles. Once again, all the credit for these in-depth numbers goes to user Blobble on Reddit, links in the video description below for the Reddit post, as well as the full spreadsheet with all the data. For all the spells we'll be ranking, we will be taking into account their upgrades with the available talents and only the spells we can apply on our spell wheels for use during combat. Prior to getting into the tier list, we first need to discuss enemy crowd-controlled states. In Hogwarts Legacy, we deal bonus damage when an enemy is crowd-controlled. The game adds 2 flat base damage to your attack and then multiplies the damage by 1.2. This results in a much larger relative damage increase for low damage spells like your basic cast than high damage spells. This plus 2 damage and 1.2x multiplier is applied to an enemy anytime they're crowd-controlled from any source, which includes being airborne, stun, special vulnerability state, for example lifting Dugbogs by their tongue, knockdown, freeze, crucio, etc. Anything that takes away the enemy's ability to move and act normally counts as a crowd control state. This bonus does not stack from multiple sources of crowd control. Here's a quick example. Our basic cast does 3 base damage per hit. If you are hitting a crowd controlled enemy, the damage is first increased by 2 and then multiplied by 1.2. 3 plus 2 is 5, multiply that by 1.2, we get 6, our damage is doubled. If we take a look at a spell with a higher base damage, like Defendo, which has a 45 base damage, against a crowd control enemy, 45 plus 2 is 47, we multiply that by 1.2, we get 56.4. As you can see, the damage increase is only 25% as opposed to doubled with our basic cast. This is due to the much larger relative damage scaling increase for low damage spells. Keep this in mind as we will be referencing the crowd control states during the spells we cover. Thanks again to Blobble for testing which spells do apply the CC status or not. I also wanted to quickly note that enemies take additional increases in damage in their special vulnerability state, and this does stack with crowd control states. If you want to know more about the vulnerability state damage multipliers, check out the video description for all the links. To get things started, we'll go right off the rip with our damaging spells, starting with Incendio. Incendio has a base damage of 50, making it the second highest normal damage spell in the game. The effective range for this spell is 500, and its cooldown is 8 seconds. Incendio also burns enemies for 3 base damage per 3 seconds for 3 ticks and is great to deal with spiders and in fairies. When we upgrade the talent for the spell with Incendio Mastery, casting Incendio now unleashes a ring of flame around you, making it an AoE powerhouse and also places enemies in a crowd control state. While the range of Incendio might be its biggest weakness, supplementing it with Accio to pull enemies towards you is a nice little combo, as well as dodge rolling into enemies with the swift upgrade to get into range. This is a solid A on our tier list, as at the end of the day, its range is lacking, even if it is less of an issue with Accio, as you can't Accio all enemy types to you. Next up is Defendo, quite possibly my favorite damaging spell in the game. It has the 3rd highest normal base damage with 45, a range of 3000, and a 15-second cooldown. You'll also find that most spells have a range of 3000 as we continue this tier list. When we upgrade the talent for Defendo with Defendo Mastery, it will now slice through impacted enemies to strike additional targets. This upgraded mastery can be hit or miss at times. Sometimes I'll see enemies in line of sight and it works extremely well, and sometimes it just whiffs. Regardless, Defendo with this amazing range and when combined with Glacius for that juicy damage multiplier on frozen enemies makes it really satisfying to use. Defendo also places enemies into a crowd control state. One of my favorite single target damage combos in this game is opening up with a Flipendo for a curse or any other spell that applies a curse, then launch a Glacius, then Defendo, then a Bombarda. You can also one-shot Dugbogs when you lift them into the air with Leviosa and follow up with the Defendo Slice. I really did want to place this into S tier since it's my favorite spell, but realistically, due to the upgraded talent for the spell being so finicky, I'll be slotting it into the A tier. Moving along to Bombarda, this spell has the 4th highest normal base damage with 35, a range of 3000, and a 15-second cooldown. With the Bombarda Mastery talent, it also causes an explosive blast with a massive AoE. Bombarda also places enemies in a crowd control state. Pro tip, if you hit a burning in fairy with Bombarda, you will deal additional damage to them. You can't really find a fault for this spell. Great damage, great range, great AoE, decent cooldown, and a part of that juicy single target damage combo. Bombarda, in my opinion, is the most well-rounded damage spell that we have, S tier. Next, we have Confringo. This spell has the 5th highest normal base damage with 25, a range of 3000, and a 10-second cooldown. Just like Incendio, Confringo burns enemies for 3 base damage per 3 seconds for 3 ticks and is great to deal with spiders and even more so in fairies with its upgraded Confringo Mastery. When upgraded, Confringo impacts produce fiery bolts that seek enemy targets. This means that most of the time you'll be able to at least put 2 to 3 Inferis on fire to be able to kill them with your other spells. Confringo also places enemies into a very brief crowd control state with its knockback and stagger. While Confringo may have a lower base damage versus its cousin in Incendio, the range and the upgraded talent giving those additional bolts, which do about half the damage of the initial hit, makes this an A tier worthy spell. For our last damage spell, we have Expelliarmus. This spell has the lowest base damage with 20, a range of 3000, and a 10-second cooldown. Expelliarmus is one of those spells in the game that benefits from 2 talents. The first one being Ancient Magic Throw Expertise, which allows us to throw disarmed enemies' weapons, and the second being Disarming Curse, which lets us apply a curse to enemies that we hit with Expelliarmus. Expelliarmus also places enemies into a crowd control state. We can also use Expelliarmus on certain enemies like the Ashwinder Executioners when they are charging their lightning attack. This causes them to lose control of the lightning, bringing down their own attack on them. Although Expelliarmus has a decent amount of utility, it can be overwhelming to use effectively when things get hectic. With it also being the lowest damaging spell in the game, I'll be ranking this one into B tier. We'll now be taking a look at our control spell, starting with Arresto Momentum. This spell has 0 base damage, with a range of 3000 and a 15-second cooldown. Arresto Momentum allows us to slow enemies by lifting them up into the air, and with the Slow Curse Mastery, we'll also apply a curse to the effective targets and put them into a crowd control state. You can pair Arresto Momentum with other spells like Depulso and Descendo so that the floating enemies will take massive damage when slammed to the ground or to the wall, even more so when they are cursed. You can also use Arresto Momentum on the last remaining enemy, if they can be floated, to finish them off with a Pontificus Totalis. With all that said, however, I'll have to rank the spell into C tier due to Levioso, as Levioso, in my opinion, is just a better version of Arresto Momentum. That said, let's talk about Levioso. This spell has no base damage, with a range of 3000 and a cooldown of 8 seconds. When combined with the Levioso Mastery, enemies near a target levitated by Levioso are also levitated, and this spell also puts enemy into a crowd control state. Levioso is my go-to combo when it comes to using it with a spell like Descendo. Levioso enemies and slam them to the ground. While Arresto Momentum has the added benefit of cursing an enemy, any enemy that we slam to the ground that is in the air will instantly die when you are a bit higher level into the game. Being able to float multiple enemies into the air is the edge that this spell has over Arresto Momentum, a solid B on the tier list. Moving along, we have Glacius. This spell has no base damage, with a range of 3000 and a cooldown of 10 seconds. When combined with its mastery, striking an enemy frozen by Glacius sends blasts damaging shards outwards from the target. I'd have to say that this mastery for Glacius is skippable and doesn't really impact the hotness of the spell. The Glacius spell applies a frozen debuff on enemies, causing them to take 2 times the damage while also putting them into a crowd control state. Do keep in mind that the 2 times damage the enemies receive is only for your next attack. Glacius, just like Arresto Momentum, will allow you to cast Pontificus Totalis on the last remaining enemy. Glacius is one of the 2 best control spells into the game and easily slots into the S tier for its insane damage boost it provides for our other attacks. For our last control spell, we have Transformation. This spell has no base damage with a range of 3000 and a 20-second cooldown. With the Transformation Mastery, enemies struck with the Transformation spell transforms into explosive objects. This is a must-take mastery for the skill, and this alone makes this an S tier spell. But wait, there's more. Transformation, with its mastery, when combined with Crucio and its mastery, as well as the Blood Curse talent, makes this your second Avada Kedavra with a 20-second cooldown. The interaction is simple. Apply Crucio to a high HP enemy, spread the curse to as many enemies as you can. You can even add curses from additional spells like Arresto Momentum, then transform a cursed mob enemy into an exploding barrel, pick up the exploding barrel, and watch as everything dies. You can also use Transformation on Poacher Animaguses to get them out of beast form, use it on your Phoenix to turn it into a pumpkin, squash, or a sack of gold, and sheeps into a ball of wool. S tier. For our next section, we will be focusing on our 4 spells, starting with Accio. This spell has no base damage with a range of 3000 and an 8-second cooldown. With its mastery, enemies near a target summoned by Accio are also pulled to you. Accio also places enemies into a crowd control state. This spell is my go-to when comboing it with close range spells like Incendio, for example. Accio is the best 4 spell in the game, A tier. Moving to our next 4 spell, we have Depulso. This spell has 40 base damage when pushing enemies into a wall and 80 base damage when pushing enemies into another enemy. Fun fact, an additional 30 AoE damage will be added to the above base damages on impact when pushing a burning enemy into something. Depulso has a range of 3000 and a 10-second cooldown. The upgraded mastery to Depulso releases an additional blast directly around you. This spell also places enemies into a crowd control state. Personally, I am not a high-octane Depulso user during combat. It's my least used force spell of the bunch, mainly because I find its use in combat less consistent than the other force spells. That said though, I do see the appeal to Depulsoing enemies into their own spells, walls, and off clips when the situation calls for it. But those situations are a dime a dozen. By the time you try to set up Depulso, you could have already killed the enemy and moved on. Depulso is the worst force spell in the game in my opinion, and I'll be slotting this into D tier. Next, we have Descendo. Descendo has a base damage of 11 when used on a ground level enemy and a 40 base damage when used to slam an airborne enemy. Descendo has a range of 3000 and a 10-second cooldown. With the Descendo mastery, a Descendo slam creates a damaging shockwave around your target. The spell also places enemies into a crowd control state. Descendo is my go-to spell when comboing with spells that lifts enemies into the air, like Leviosa, Flipendo, and Arresto Momentum. If you do happen to use Descendo without lifting enemies into the air, it still does some damage and still creates the damaging shockwave if enemies are near. B tier. Lastly, for our force spells, we have Flipendo. This spell has no base damage with a range of 3000 and one of the shortest cooldowns in the games with 5 seconds. With the upgraded mastery and knockback curse, Flipendo will apply a curse to the targeted enemy. Flipendo also places enemies into a crowd control state. I feel like Flipendo is a spell that gets overlooked quite a lot. With its low cooldown, it's super spammable to apply curses and CC enemies left and right. It's also great versus Dugbogs and Trolls. You can flip Dugbogs and the Club of Trolls, putting them into a vulnerability state for increased damage. It's also my go-to curse application spell for my favorite one-shot combo that I mentioned earlier in Flipendo, Glacius, Defendo, and Bombarda. You can also use Flipendo on cows. If you haven't tried that yet, go do it. This one is another solid B on the tier list for me. Heading to our unforgivable spells, we're going to start with Crucio. Crucio is the highest normal damage dealing spell in the game with a base damage of 88, 3000 range, and a 20-second cooldown. Crucio also places all enemies into a crowd control state, even if they are crowd control immune. That's right, for its 20-second duration, every enemy in the game will not only take increased damage due to the curse effect, but also the crowd control effect, and don't forget the tick damage during this time as well. With its mastery, striking an enemy cursed by Crucio releases a projectile that curses nearby enemies. Pro tip, you can also go into an invulnerable state when casting the spell thanks to its animation. This is one of the best talents in the game for any spell. This spell easily slots into the S tier. For our next curse, we have Imperio. This spell has no base damage with a range of 3000 and a 30-second cooldown. With the Imperio mastery, any enemy under your control with Imperio curses other targets with each successful strike. This spell is another banger. Imperio, an enemy you don't want to deal with right away, for example a troll, and watch as it just clears the battlefield for you. I also like to Imperio ranged enemies, for example the Goblin Archers, so that it can apply curse to multiple enemies with ease. Imperio will also allow you to use Pontificus Totalis on any enemy if they are the last or only enemy left in battle. Just like Crucio, this spell will also place you into an invulnerable state when casted thanks to its animation. S tier. Last but definitely not least, we have Avada Kedavra. This is the highest special damage dealing spell in the game with a base damage of 10 million, 3000 range, and a whopping 90-second cooldown. With its mastery, killing an enemy with Avada Kedavra kills all cursed enemies. Yeah, that's pretty busted, but that's the killing curse for you. Open with the Crucio on a high HP enemy, spread the curse. Note that you can also use all of your other spells that will apply a curse here, and fire your Avada Kedavra and watch as nothing is left standing. Pro tip, you don't need to apply a curse on the enemy you target with Avada Kedavra to benefit from its mastery. This is sometimes helpful if you have enemies on opposite sides of the field and you can't apply a curse on the last remaining target. You can also use a focus potion to reduce the cooldown from 90 seconds to 20 seconds for the spell. Easily S tier. Lastly, we're going to mention our utility spells here as 3 of them can be used in combat. We'll first start with Disillusionment. Disillusionment has no base damage, no range, and a cooldown of 0.5 seconds. This is the go-to spell when using a stealth build, and with its low cooldown, you can easily spam this during stealth combat pretty effectively. If you apply the ambush trait, even though enemies can spot you, as long as you're not fully revealed, you will benefit from the damage increase and can easily one-shot trolls with Pontificus Totalis when paired with the ambush trait. Solid B on the tier list. Next, we have Lumos. Lumos has no base damage, no range, and a 0.5 second cooldown. You may be wondering, how is Lumos used in combat? Well, you see it's mainly for quite the cheesy interaction. Lumos is used for the cheese when paired with the Focus Potion Mastery. This mastery extends the duration of the Focus Potion when any spell from the spell set is cast during its use. For example, this means we can apply all 3 of our Unforgivable Curses and Lumos into one spell wheel, pop a Focus Potion, spam all our curses, then spam Lumos to extend the Focus Potion duration, and rinse and repeat. A solid C on our cheese list. For the last utility spell, we have Wingardium Levioso. This spell has the second highest special damage in the game with a base damage of 250, but only when dropping an item on an enemy. The drop height does not matter. This spell also does 15 base damage when you drag an item into an enemy and goes through shields and breaks them as well. This one is super fun to cheese and can be quite entertaining to do when you're in stealth. Just like Lumos, I'ma slot this into C on our cheese tier list. Here's a look at our full spell tier list. Feel free to pause the video here to take a look, or you can find the full link to this image in the video description down below. Before we end the video, I wanted to discuss combos in Hogwarts Legacy, more specifically late game 3-4 spell combos on mob enemy types, as I don't see this being mentioned a whole lot. I took a poll recently regarding how useful you all thought 3-4 spell combos on mob enemies were in the later half of the game compared to those same combos in the early to mid game. The results were favorable, not as useful since most mob enemies die in one spell. For example, a really fun early to mid game combo on mob enemies can start with an Accio into a Descendo, into a Glacius, into a Defendo. If you do the same combo in the late game, they'll die instantly on the Descendo cast. The underlying cause for this is our insane player scaling we discussed in our Talents tier list video. While 3-4 spell combos are still great on higher HP elite enemies like Dugbogs, Ashwinder, Executioners, and Trolls, we won't be able to utilize most of our Force and Control spells since these enemy types are too heavy to be affected by them unless they are placed into a vulnerability state, for example lifting Dugbogs by their tongue. This is the main reason my go-to 4-spell combo for these enemy types are Flipendo or any other spell to apply a curse into a Glacius, Defendo, Bombarda. Or you can just Ancient Magic and Veggie attack them off the face of the earth. 2-spell combos, however, are still great into the late game, for example, Accio into Incendio. So, to everyone who is curious as to what combos look like in the endgame, my simple advice is to just not stress out about it and cycle through your spell wheels and use what's comfortable to you. It's a real shame that we do lose that satisfying ability to chain combos later into the game, simply because we get too strong. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for coming to my second TED Talk. Remember to check out that amazing spreadsheet by Blobble for the full deep dive on all of the numbers. Links again are in the description down below. Feel free to check out any of my other Hogwarts Legacy content that should be popping up anytime now. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell for the next deep dive tier list video we'll be doing on Talents. I'd also love it if you could follow me on my Twitch at twitch.tv/PlaterBear. Thanks again for all the support. Till the next one, peace.